Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Geof Huth, and we're here today to talk about archives and about a book of mine that came out from SPD Books entitled The Anarchivist. My wife, Karen Jamison Trivette, is here, and she and I are going to have a conversation. I expect at some point to dip in the book, at least briefly, to give you some sense of what it's about by hearing the actual words in it. And so, Karen, whatever you want to do.
I'm happy just to say hello to everyone and to let everyone know I am also an archivist. I work at the Fashion Institute of Technology, part of the State University of New York here in New York City. And Geof and I have been married for about 5 years, and we have worked together in the past, and it's been a wonderful journey so far, and I know it will continue to be. But I want to focus on the book. Tell me, how did you come up with the title?
The title is interesting, but it's very, very old. So the title is from the early 1990s. The title is how I used to end my my correspondence. I wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters in my youth. That's all that I did because that was the way to communicate to people. And so at the end of it, instead of saying I was an archivist, I said Anarchivist. So I said I was both an archivist and something that wasn't an archivist, and something that was tearing apart the order that archives are supposed to be in, and probably bringing them back to their original disorder. That's where it comes from. It was just one of the ways I ended the work. I actually said a sever as one word instead of as ever, comma, wrote my name, and then wrote an archivist.
Awesome. And I know this was just such a labor of love for you. It's a compilation of essays that you worked for how long in terms of start to finish?
This was probably, these are mostly, if not entirely now, essays that I wrote over a period of 3 years. I was just trying to think about archives in brief essays, to say, here, what's an issue that I want to talk about and I want to look at, and I want to think about what's an issue that I want to understand more, because I understand by writing. And when I write it, then I figure out what I know and I haven't articulated. And it was just something, it was something to do, and it was a way to revive an old blog that I had that really used to document my archival activities. When I went to conferences, certain other essays that I wrote, I would post in there. And that's what it became. The blog kind of slowed down after Holly asked me to, Holly, who was the publisher, Holly Crawford, asked me to put the book together. And then I focused on finishing the book and putting it together.
And even starting with the cover, it's just a beautiful, beautiful edition. What's on the cover?
The cover, just so you can see it and you can think about it a little bit. The cover here is a commission. That's it, what it is. It's a commission from the New York Court of Chancery. And so what a commission is this. It's that we have a civil case in the Court of Chancery, and they need some evidence, and so they need somebody to go and take a deposition. And they give people a commission, and they then go out, they get the deposition, and then they bring it back. And so these are for people who are witnesses, but they are out of the state and sometimes out of the country. So some of these, when the depositions come back with the commissions, they also have that they're in Spanish, or they're in Italian, or
Wow.
they're in French, which I don't know how they dealt with it, but we now have interpreters in the court system, so they probably did then. And they come in with all these ribbons and all these seals because this is supposed to ensure their authenticity, that they really are what they were, because we've sealed it so well and nobody has been able to get into it without showing they've gotten into it and changed it. And therefore, it is a real and true record. And so they're very interesting series, and they do come in different forms. And this is just one of thousands of photographs I took of the records as we were inventorying roughly 12,000 cubic feet of records. A project not yet done because of some pandemic. I can't remember. You guys may have heard of it.
Yeah. So how, other than the court records, what other records informed your essay writing that ultimately resulted in the book?
Primarily my career, and by primarily I mean all but maybe 18 months, was working with government records in one way or another. So there are plenty of references to government records in here, and more than there are to manuscripts, etc. Though I do cover those as well. And so I mostly dealt with local governments in New York State, sometimes very small local governments that had tiny archives, but they would also be the oldest records for that place on earth, meaning they might only go back to 1895, but there's nothing even close to that old to document that town.
Right.
And so they remain the sort of core archives of a relatively undocumented community. And because of that, and you see that in these records, there's lots of dirt in my work. My work has always had lots of dirt. Archivists like to claim that archives are not dirty and they're not dusty. However, I've been to thousands of them, and 90% of them were. Because we don't think of the ones that are sort of a little less professional. They're still run by professionals. It's just their profession isn't archives. And they're too busy to do all their work. And so this is how this disorder comes into being. It's a little bit sad that these records that are covered in this book, which is a book of essays and photographs and quotations and a single short story. Those photographs all come from that one project that I worked on and that we're still going to work on. And what they show is that records are not always taken care of well.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it's a weird juxtaposition because it's sometimes a sacred relationship with records that we have that we call archives, or they're completely dismissed. And I think that reaches back to your title as an anarchivist, something where archives is not like the push-pull of an idea. Can you respond to that?
So last week, somebody said, well, we have these records and they're not scheduled. So a record that's scheduled is a record that you know when you're supposed to throw it away. And in the case of records that are archives, that time is never. And she said she could tell they could be thrown away. Oh. And I wondered, how she could tell they could be thrown away. And I believe that it was because they were old. However, they were records of the chief administrative judge of the court system. So the only person higher than the chief administrative judge is the chief judge. This means these are from virtually the highest realm of our organization. meaning the chances that they're permanent are much higher than for any other person except for the chief judge. So people don't understand records a lot of the time. They don't understand records because they don't know what they're for, and because it's a foreign concept to have a huge body of records. Even when they have a huge body of records, they don't necessarily conceptualize it as that. So if you look at families, families sometimes have fairly significant archives, but they're in disorder. They're not really understood. They haven't been gone through so that people can actually understand what they're doing and what they mean. In my family, our family archives go back to 1875. So we have relatively old archives for a family, all of which are in this apartment of ours. And
not the family, but the records.
Right. Thank goodness. I have a lot of siblings.
Yes.
And they don't understand the value. Some people do, some people don't. And sometimes the value of archives becomes merely the value for them as physical objects, meaning their visual aura, this sense that they've gone through a hard life, but they're still here and they hold some kind of information.
Well, speaking of which, you have a specimen from your work with archival records as it manifests into a poem. And would you like to talk about it?
Okay, she sent it to me. See, people, the interesting thing is this. So before I show it to you, here's the interesting thing. Archives often, especially for archivists, have this aura to them, which is, you know, that people have touched these, they've created these, they've somehow made these with their own hands. Even if they're digital, they've made these with their own hands. And so there's some sort of connection back to these people, even in those cases with government archives, when you don't know who those people are. And so that's part of what this project is. These records were kept for 100 years in the highest part, over 100 years, in the highest part of a building with hugely hot, not furnaces, but radiators going off for 100 years. And so many of these records are very fragile. And so we take care of them. But many records have fallen into pieces and we don't know where the pieces are. So we would sweep up all these fragments over the course of a day, which could be a gallon's worth of dirt and fragments of paper and occasionally of parchment. And we would throw them away. And then I one day took a picture of one of them. And then I saw that they were this story about an archives that was falling apart and that was losing its meaning, sometimes by the letter, sometimes by the word, sometimes by the phrase. And I realized they had this sort of, this aura of meaning, even though part of the meaning was stripped out. So this one says, hereby is G. So probably something is missing from it.
Yeah.
And I realized it had a deep connection with my artistic work, which is visual poetry. I make paintings and sculptures and drawings that I call visual poetry because they have some sort of, they have words in them or letters in them or senses of things that are letter-like. And I said, well, I should do something with all the stuff we're throwing away, old string, old red tape. And I took them. But part of the aura of this is something that's personal, but it's hard to understand. As a boy, I lived many places, many countries, many continents. And one of the places I lived was Barbados. And this stone is roughly in the shape of Barbados, roughly. So if you were from Barbados, you would look at it and you would say, that's Barbados. I can see it. You know, Spitestown is here. It's 14 miles across this way. It's 21 miles up and down. That's what they taught us. This is Bridgetown right here, which is where I lived most of the time, except when I was up in St. Lucy's. And we used to spend much of our time in the U.S. Navy base that was up here, where we would collect out of the sand spent lead bullets and spent shells of the bullets.
Wow.
So this is sort of tied together as if it's trying to hold the past, but it has this significance that only I really feel, that even somebody from Barbados is not going to feel, because they don't have the connection to all of these objects. A sandstone I found somewhere, these pieces of string and paper that I found in the archives.
It's like a three-dimensional memory.
Yeah.
That's cool. And how many of these have you made?
It's over 400, so I don't know exactly, but I have it written down somewhere, but I don't know. It's probably closer to 450, especially since I found one the other day that I'd never documented.
Wow. So back to the book. Curious about its design. It's so beautifully done. How did these decisions get made?
Well, let's just say Holly has a great designer in R.A. Hazel, who was a wonder to work with and just a magician. The way she operated was interesting. So I thought she had something good, and then she would do something else, and I said, well, geez, that's better. And so she worked on it the way I would work on an essay. Well, I've done it. Okay, it looks good. And now I got to look at it again. What else can I do? But some of the things in here, I believe the ideas came from her. So the idea to have so many photographs, it's filled with photographs, sometimes full page photographs.
Just beautiful.
That show the records that I'm talking about. There's color on every page so that you can see things. See, here's like a fragment that I found, and I say to myself, that sort of has some kind of meaning. What do you do with it? I don't know what happened to it. I might have found the document that it went in and stuck it in there, but I took a photograph of it. And here is the one that essentially made me think about this project. You know, this scattering of text and letters and the word am.
Ooh, biblical.
I exist.
Exactly.
And she also, at least to my mind, Holly can tell me if I'm wrong, or she can shake her head. Hazel came up with the idea of adding in quotations. So we have a podcast, which is active, but not as active as we used to be, and where we interview archivists. And for our Twitter feed, we would put out quotations from archives, and Hazel collected some of those, and then I made changes and additions, etc. And now the book is filled with them. And so it's like a little pause, it's a little respite just to think of one thing. Because sometimes I think a single sentence, a quotation taken out of context, is exactly an essay. And so it begins and ends with Bell Hooks, who's a well-known Black feminist, I'll call her a philosopher, but and writer, and a great and funny woman to spend time with. I've spent a lot of time with her. And so I open and close the book and with quotes from her. maybe I should have sent her a copy. Anyhow, so she said, so it opens with who gets to have a voice, who gets to have an archive. And this isn't anything she wrote. She used to come to this Archives Leadership Institute that we held in Berea, Kentucky, and she would just talk off the top of her head. And I would always tweet out what she was saying so that it would remember. And then I put at the very end a sort of cautionary note. It was Bell again saying, the real issue is, are archivists trustworthy? Which gets to a real core issue in archives, which is that you have to believe in the truth of the record, not that it's saying the truth, but that the record is what it says it is. You have to be able to understand and believe in that truth. The other truth you have to figure out, and it is the archivist who is charged with finding out, making sure that they're taking care of that first truth.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was just something to remind us of things, because I'm someone who likes to question what I do all the time and make sure I'm doing it right and accept when I'm not. And that she helps me do that.
Well, probably the most mysterious aspect of our work is that of appraising records for values, including their legitimacy. So does appraisal enter into any of your essays?
It must. It must, because the longest thing I've written about archives is about appraisal.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm always talking about appraisal, and I'm always talking about how to do it as well as possible. And I'm always talking about how it's impossible to do well enough, meaning you're always going to have too much stuff or too little.
True. There's no perfect solution. But for people who don't know about archival appraisal, essentially, archivists are charged with deciding what's kept and what's not kept. And things enter into that decision making, like how much shelf space you have. Does the archival record reflect your collecting scope, which varies all over the globe? In every repository, it's going to have a different scope of collecting. So there are all these measures you have to apply to records to say, I'll keep them or I'll discard them. And so that's why I asked about it, because it's the most subjective on some surface aspect of our work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in my work, which we probably don't want to talk about too much, we at the New York State Archives, I oversaw appraisal, and the issue was we were very professional about it. We had standards for evidence, hours-long meetings,
Yes.
where we made decisions. And the real truth is, I was always the one in favor of throwing things away, because I was the one who worked with actual entities when they were dealing with their current records, and I knew the volume, and they knew the problems dealing with that volume. So we're trying to find what is this smallest piece, the smallest portion of a body of records that needs to be kept, so we know enough to have some useful information in the future.
Right.
And we did that all the time, I think fairly successfully. Unfortunately, one of my great appraisal reports was reversed after I left the state archives, but I believe only for political reasons. I wrote about that one. That one was in there.
So another value we assign to records would be intrinsic value. And I think intrinsic value really plays a role in the manuscript collection that you referred to and wrote about in the book, the Valerie Fuchs collection, manuscript collection. And when I say intrinsic value, I mean, does the physical nature of the records hold informational value? Does it need to be experienced as a physical specimen to understand it in
Mhm.
its fullest capacity? So can you talk a little bit about that experience and about Valerie?
Uh, Valerie Fuchs was a designer. She designed isotoner gloves, probably the most famous gloves you can think of. Certainly it is for me. And she was quite a fine designer, and she knew gloves in incredible detail. I learned about her not directly through Karen, though I heard about it. I learned about her because Karen went on business trip and I got to go along with her. So meaning, I got to pay my way, and her institution didn't, pay her back for all of her expenses. But and we had a dinner with some people who were donors to the archive, donors of money or donors of papers. And one of the donors and his wife was there. And the man was Tom Fuchs. And Tom told me the story of his mother. And the story of his mother was the story of living through World War II by hiding um, in sheds and under houses as they were avoiding the Nazis. It's the story of a family of two people, just a man and his wife, and who were spared by the Nazis originally because he was a dentist and the Nazis needed dentists, but knew that it was too dangerous, and they spent probably over a year of evading the Nazis and trying to stay alive along with other people. And part of the story, and he tells me this story, and then he takes out his phone and he shows me these pictures. And these pictures are these little drawings, these tiny little geometric drawings. They look like designs for lace. And that's what she would do when they were there in the partial darkness, no, likely. And she would write these very meticulous and very geometrical drawings. One side mirrored the other. Mm. And I think that was a way for her to escape into concentration, to escape into her mind, to escape into the act of creation, so she wouldn't be filled with the reality that surrounded her and the reality which at any point could overcome her and extinguish her. And she kept these. And she only had one bag. She only had one little bag that she had, and she kept these things. And they are the oldest objects she has in her manuscript collection. They're very small. They're sometimes just maybe 3 by 4 inches square. They probably didn't have a lot of access to paper, and they're done in pencil, and they're really beautiful. But she carried them with her. She carried them with her after they escaped, after her son was born, after they made it to the U.S. And because they're a talisman now, they're this reminder to her of how she survived. And they're this physical reminder. They stay. Even when she perishes, they persist. And so it just has this real sense, the story of the magic of archives, of how you can't sometimes escape it, that you just feel it. And I felt it almost immediately. And then I researched her life and I wrote a story. And I told Holly, I have one more essay to put in, as we were finishing up the book, and I just have to write it and that's why it's not well proofread by me. But and I wrote it while going into when in the beginning of the pandemic, into the heft of the pandemic. I wrote it at this table on that side as I was waiting for it. And I connected my different story of isolation from the world to hers, and recorded just a few details of what was going on that day, how many people had died as of that point, so that this would be my own record of this kind.
Well, and two words come to mind as you're talking and as I reflect on the manuscript collection, because it's housed at FIT. Words control. I think of control as I think of those early drawings of hers. It was a way she could take control of her circumstances in some small way, whereas everything else was out of her control. And then I think of protection. And another charge we have as archivists is to protect, preserve, make secure the records so that generations that come after us can consult the records and make decisions based on the evidence they give up over time. I also thought, in terms of protection, the fact that she gravitated towards designing gloves, which are essentially meant to protect part of the body. And it makes me want to talk to her son again, Tom, just to get a sense of if she had that in mind at any point in her career trajectory.
It would be interesting to know. I'm sure that she felt some power from those, though. It seems impossible not to. I could feel it. And her son, Tom, was essentially telegraphing this to me.
Yes.
I just had to put it together.
We were all seated at a big round table. There were about 7 or 8 of us, and I could see the exchange between Geof and Tom, and was delighted that there was a germ of a story going on there. So it's a wonderful story you've told about Valerie and her archives. So it's just great. Now, you had said you wanted to read a passage from the book.
I suppose I could. Apparently, I always get gunky when I have to read. I don't know. I found a paragraph that I thought would be good, and it's I kind of connect this one to the last issue too, because the last story, because it's about objects and their power, but I don't get to that so much. This is about a story we learned about in Salamanca, Spain, when we were there for a conference. And this archivist was telling this absolutely wonderful story about the tale of Jumbo the elephant, which is a very prized object in the archives of her institution, but which is not an elephant's tail at all, but a reproduction of an elephant's tail, and is not even the original elephant's tail, but a reproduction of that. So here's the opening, but it gets to the way that I think about and feel about archives. We are bound to and inspired by symbol. The real world continues to exist in its multifarious diversity. The solid earth rests beneath our feet. We breathe the air. We eat the earth sweet. We pour huge cold draughts of water into our parched mouths. But it is symbol that moves us most, because our cultural representations of mere things and the hopes and aspirations and meanings we attach to these give them power. The objects and concrete realities of our earth may be beautiful, even inspiring in their own right, but it is the shared and sometimes contrived significance we apply to them that gives them their meaning, their power. their glowing immanence comes from the light we have lit within in them. And that is the light of these drawings of darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And it is strangely even the light of a doubly fake elephant's tail.
So it is.
Which ends up being so symbolically resonant for that university that it defines them. But it doesn't matter if that's ridiculous. That's immaterial. It matters that somebody feels things.
Mm-hmm.
And when somebody feels something, they're likely to be able to do something.
Well, I like to think of archives as a place for meaning making. And with the archives, we can all make meaning from the circumstances around us.
Mm-hmm.
Anything to add?
To meaning or
to
everything else?
The conversation.
Meaning is why I'm in this game.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm in this game for data. This is the interesting thing, data. So if you say data, they say, Geof, well, why are you trying to bore me so much? Really? What do you think data is? What do you think data carries? What do you think if you can, it depends on what the data is. You might not be interested in all of it, but I like data and I like being able to understand something and to put something together.
Mm-hmm.
And so archives are essentially potential stories. They're not the story themselves. They are just potential stories. There are things that you can find out and then you can piece together, and that one archives might not have enough information. You might have to go to different sources. You have to make the connections. You have to create the meaning. You have to see what the past was and recreate it. Recreate it in your mind and then recreate it in text, in image, and in whatever you need to or can use to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a powerful human capability. It is the thing that keeps us so different from every other being that lives on this earth.
The abstraction capability to abstract.
To abstract, but and to create a story and to retain stories over time so that they can be heard again, understood again, felt again, millennia later.
And interpreted again.
Right. So, and that's that's the great thing about it. The great thing is that an archives and a record in an archives can be true and false at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
It can be, an accurate document actually made as the creator made it and have nothing that's actually true in it except the creator's name.
Right.
All of this can happen. And so archives are not any true truth. They're just this hope for truth and this hope for understanding. Mm-hmm. So at the end of the book, I sort of get to that by deciding to do an experiment and to take the slave revolt of 1712 in New York City and tell the story only from the minute books that governed it. Mm-hmm. So I look at those minute books and I read every single trial, every single thing that happened before the trial, every single conviction, and every single person who was let off. And it's an interesting thing. And just so you know something about this slave revolt, it's sort of famous, meaning if you're an historian of New York State history, you will definitely consider it famous. Mm-hmm. But it was essentially a failed rebellion by the slaves of New York. The slaves of New York who were Black and indigenous, who were male and female. And they were all fighting because they were trying to win their freedom. And the thing that scares me, and I talk about this all the time, is that they had to know they'd fail. They'd
Yeah.
had to know that there was no chance, but that even if you don't have any chance, the only chance you have is doing something. And so they tried it. And then the results of my review were kind of interesting because I was a little surprised, meaning they actually carried out trials and had reasonable means of trying to be fair, and only about half the people were convicted. So they were actually show trials. But in the end, I don't know if people survived because they they were deemed innocent, or if they survived because their 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 surviving masters didn't want to lose their property, and they made sure that they weren't convicted.
Right.
And so it's a strange thing, and I haven't looked into it. I don't know anything about this slave trial except about this revolt, except for what I read in the minute book. That's the only thing that tells me, and it is flaking to bits. I could barely move it. All I did was take pictures and then never touch it again.
Right.
And so, but that tells you something about how you don't know what the story is. The archive doesn't tell you. The archive itself isn't adequate enough. You need multiple sources of information. You need to question things. You need to bring everything together to make sense out of it.
What's on the horizon?
Well, I don't know. I'm not writing essays at the moment because I'm doing other things. But I do, so my major project right now is to document my life in as much detail as possible. So exactly where I was in as precise a way as I can, which sometimes is to the minute. So I can tell you to the minute here. There are some days I can tell you what I was doing every part of the day. But and it's an exercise in what I call para archives. It's something like archives, but it's not really archives. It's like when archives make records. So when archives make do oral histories, I consider that a valuable activity, but I consider it para archives. That means it's related to archives, but you have created it. So you're the record creator, but as the archivist, you created it. So it's something slightly different. It's contaminated is too strong a word, but I'll say contaminated by the archivist being involved at the same time.
Right.
And so this para archives project is a memory project. I come from a family who has dementia. On my grandmother's side, people get dementia. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather was virtually incoherent from at least 1970, when he was 71 or 72 years old. And so I could be close to that. So my father is supposedly a bit like that now, but he's 80 something, so he's doing fine. So I have a genetic disposition to memory, and I consider my memory bad. I think the reason I like archives and I like records is that I can be remembered. I can remember.
Yes.
Because it can tell me it, and then I can remember something after I get this little bit of evidence for it. And so it's telling me something about my life, but it also tells you something about the repetitions of your life. And archives are often like that. We often think of these things like these great, beautiful, unique things, but there were 100,000 of these things for every unique, case that came before the New York County Supreme Court, for instance. And so they're not unique. There are patterns of repetition. And we go through patterns of repetition, and they teach us how the world works. They teach us how to remember, and they tie us together into sort of a body of humankind.
across time.
Mhm.
Well,
And across time.
yes, it suits that your subtitle is History, Memory, and Archives, because you dig deeply into all three of those.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I hope it's true. Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I think about is the inadequacy of archives, its limits. It's always incapable. You cannot reclaim the past. You can just see this vague simulacrum of it, and you have to live with that. And yet you can still feel the resonances through that fog.
Right. Well, thank you for your efforts in this book, and I look forward to the next one.
Okay, the next one's a bunch of drawings that look like this.
We have Holly here, who maybe
I'll
she wants
answer
to
some of
mention something.
one of your questions. The quotes were purely Hazel's idea, and she didn't even. I give people a lot of latitude, and she didn't, even come to me and say, "Hey, I'm going to put quotes or research quotes." I give them a lot of latitude, and since my was knowing you took photographs from seeing Facebook and knowing that you took the photographs and you're an archivist, and I knew that was, I told her we are going to do this book in color. All our other books are in black and white, but I said, we have to do this book in color. Doing full bleeds in black and white and black pages, if you've seen the other books, and interesting graphics, we do that. And so it just, your book had to be in color. It just, there's no way it wouldn't get across the full feel of what you were trying. It's on this, so that's what went on there. On the slavery revolt is interesting. Maybe they hoped to, because of that time period, to go further west and escape, because in that period there, not too much wet, even in
Right.
Western Pennsylvania or something, or hang out. But there were no names.
They don't have surnames. They don't have surnames.
That's what I mean, no surnames.
That's right. They're the only people. There were two people at the very end of the trials who had pseudo surnames. It was Peter the Porter and Peter the something else. And so the Porter and the other things seemed to be put in place merely to distinguish them at that time. But it was interesting. Both of those gentlemen got off. But and people were killed in brutal ways. And I always think that the worst, well, you can take your pick between being drawn and quartered or being hung up without water or food until you die. So you're not going to hang to death because it's nothing around your throat, but those are the ways they did it. So the barbarity was interesting. So, and disturbing.
Well, thank you for writing the essays and agreeing to let me publish the book. And I'd like to thank everyone who's come. Anybody else have any questions?
Can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi, Holly. Hi, Geof. And nice to meet you, Karen.
Hi.
Geof, this was
Hello,
such this is Eileen Tapias. This was such a fascinating presentation, and I learned a lot, but I also was surprised, pleasingly so, by some aspects you raised. And I was trying to imagine, because I know your work as a visual poet, I can see some logic as to why you've created some of the works you've done as a visual poet. When I think about your work as an archivist, as you describe it, as specifically how you, at some point, or maybe still are, were in charge of making decisions of what to include or exclude from archives, which opens the way to, of course, who determines what becomes recorded as, or what becomes recorded as history. And I can see there that as a result, for you as a poet, I imagine that the inherited words, including inherited shapes of words, would be insufficient. And so that I see the abstraction effect on some of what you've been doing as a poet. And I was curious about, maybe if you can talk about that, but also my second question before I forget was,
Okay.
You're creating your own archives. You call it para archives as you live now. And I'm wondering what that implies to me is that you're actually trying to include as many things or everything that you can into your para archives, versus it seems like your professional work as an archivist, which must delete a lot.
Right.
And how does that,
Right.
relate? So
It's easy to explain that. So I'm going to forget the first question. So I better get this one. I'll remember it. It's something about letter forms. Okay, that'll tell me. So the issue is this. Value, when I talk about appraisal, how to determine if a record needs to be kept or not, I always say appraisal only happens in context, and it only happens in context of the person making the appraisal and who they're making it for. So that means that if I were appraising the records of a state agency, which I've done, I might say, well, we don't need these records, and we'll throw them away, and we do need these. However, if we got a record that was not that came to us that was not a government record, we would always appraise it as not having any value for us because it doesn't fit in our context. It can't come into our archives because it's not what our archives holds. So things can be archival. Things are archival in some places, but won't be in other places merely because that's not the place for them. There is some kind of home that it can meet. So most government archives end up in government institutions that are responsible for holding those archives. But if you have personal papers, they could go any place that actually collects those personal papers. But again, they'd be making decisions. They'd be saying, well, this is a great set of personal papers about somebody who collected lots of information and really looked at the death penalty across the world and gives us lots of information. But we're a design archives, and this has nothing to do with us, so it does not have any value there. And the same thing happens when you look at my project. So this one para-archival project, which is monstrously huge and complicated. It allows me to count, by the way. So today I said, hey, Karen, do you know how many flights I've taken that I know of? 456. 456. So what you can do with that? Nothing. It's valueless information, except that it's sort of curiously interesting to have some number, which I know is probably half of the flights I actually ever took. And so but to me, it's important for those personal reasons I talked about. The fear of the loss of memory, my loss of memory all the time. I'm always surprised at how much my brothers and sisters remember, all of whom are younger than I am though, compared to me, who barely seems to have remembered anything in my past except for a few big issues. And so to me, this body of information is interesting because I can see it in context. I can find out, oh, this is when that happened. Oh, this happened soon before it. Now I'm understanding how this came on. And yesterday I was doing a part of, it actually came quite a bit into today as well. I was going through some records and massaging the data into my database. And then I realized all sorts of things. I started to see how I could fill out the database because I saw the pattern, and then I could repeat the pattern. and know what was going on. So to me, it's valuable. Now, will it be valuable for anybody else? Not necessarily. As a matter of fact, I would claim no. But at the same time, there's one complication. I have papers at the University of Albany, and they are very extensive, a huge body of material, because it it holds all my creative works, which are many, many thousands and many hundreds in physical three-dimensional form. And this tells something about me. This tells something about who I am. So even you don't even have to read the whole thing to understand that it's sort of this message being sent out. So the first question, see, I'm remembering, Eileen. I think there is something deep in me that is connected to text, and there's an essay in my next book, which actually talks about this. And my first school was in Portugal, and it was a German school. So we were taught in Portuguese and in German. So I went there one day, and I didn't know Portuguese or German. And then, 2 years, year and a half later, I left and I spoke German and Portuguese, which I don't speak anymore. I can pronounce them though, in case you need pronunciation. But at that school, which I always pronounce as the Deutsche Schule zu Porto, thereby including English, Portuguese, and German in the name. They would make us go through these very elaborate writing routines so that we would learn how to write the letters and learn how to make them perfectly. It's like when you see the kindergarten script. It was the kindergarten script, but it wasn't exactly the same. It's different in European practice. And so I was very careful. I was a careful child, and I was carefully trying to always get everything perfectly. And I'd be sad if I couldn't. There was too much space between two words or not enough space. And so I was entranced by them. And then I was entranced because if my parents wrote some of those letters, they would write them differently. They wouldn't look the same. Their capital H would be much different from mine. Their small letter P would be significantly different from mine. And yet they meant the same thing. They both meant H, or they both meant A. And so, and that's why I'm a visual poet, because the visual representation of language interests me, because it shows the possibility of the code that it's in. So the code is not just the letter form itself, but how it can be changed and manipulated, etc. And so that sort of guides a lot of my work. And right now, as you were referring to, most of my work is letter-like. I'm making things that look like letters, but they don't actually spell anything out, even if I claim they do.
Right. But by the way, a follow-up, what happens to the archives that you deem not to fit a particular archive's context? I mean, are they sent elsewhere?
So if something came to an archives that I ran and it wasn't good for us, we would then tell them, here are some other repositories you should go to. That would make more sense. And one of the things is to make sure that smaller places have their archives, so that not everything is in a big city. So it's to try to say, geez, this is really telling something about your small town or your county, and you need to get it to that county archives if you can, or to the historical society there. And those are good, valuable, and legitimate places, because there are homes for things most of the time.
And on my last comment, because I don't want to dominate the Q&A, is I just want to share that on your counting exercise, I was thrilled to hear that just now because it reminded me, you know, Richard Brautigan wrote The Hawkline Monster, and there was a character, Cameron, who counted everything in his life. The sentence I love is, Cameron was a counter. He vomited 19 times to San Francisco. And when I read that novel, I was struck by the idea of counting everything in your life. And that was actually one of the root core inspirations to my invention of the Hainaku, which is a 6-word set. It was the whole counting notion. So you never know what someone might stumble across your archives, see you counting all these things, and might create something decades later that had nothing to do with what you were counting as you were jogging up the steps in the skyscraper. So.
Right. And the Hainaku still has legs. I mean, I
I
saw
know,
a
it's
new one
amazing.
just last week.
Yeah, Yuka-Pekka Kurvinen said, it's amazing. Most of these things die off in a year or two. And they were like, we're heading towards its 20th anniversary. It's like ridiculous.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. Thank you for both of you.
Sure.
I had a couple of comments to say. Can you hear me? Or
Yes.
Yes. There were several things. In fact, I thought it was interesting what you said about the title, about anarchist, because when I read the title, I thought of anarchy. And so I thought, oh, that's a really interesting way of thinking about an archive, because when you create an archive, it can also be an act of anarchy, because you can go against, you know, the way that history has been told and say, I'm going to tell more. I'm going to say, you know, that history that you've archived in one collection is not the true history, and I'm going to create anarchy by creating my own history, or creating a truer version of history by adding, you know, a fuller picture of what's happened. And so that I thought was really fantastic, the title. And then also I was thinking about, well, I really liked that Karen, you brought up about the gloves and protection and these elements, and I was thinking about the gloves as hands, and the idea that an archive is so much about, you know, maybe wearing white gloves to touch everything, and it's about your hands and about a sense of tactility, but not actually necessarily being able to touch something. So you have some kind of difference between permeability or ability to have the sensory connection. And then that made me think about how, you know, your artwork, the visual poetry then relates to two different things. I was thinking about Andre Breton, who had he a surrealist, Andre Breton. He made object poems, and I don't know if you know about his object poems, because they're not so well sort of advertised in a way in art history. And I saw many years ago in the Museum of Modern Art's library a book that was a French publication of his object poems.
Oh, wow.
And I think you would love them. If you ever can go to the library there, I think you would really enjoy. I can find the actual name so that I can give it to you. I used to own a copy of it. It was a really, really beautiful book. And then from there, I was thinking about how this idea of these fragments, like you mentioned a few words, you know, you're like, this is something. It was just a little, couple words that was in a fragment. And when I worked at the Pratt Institute Library, because I went to school there for my master's, and they have a really great rare book collection, and some wonderful poetry books. And they have one that was particularly great translations with the originals of Sappho's Fragments. And really, I mean, almost all of the poetry that we know of Sappho, we only have these kind of things, these little morsels that have so much poignancy to them. You know, they're really powerful. And you think, wow, there's something there. You know, you can fill in the blanks, you fill in your own story, and about how much that is, because when we at least for myself, when I'm, doing research and you have a vast amount of material, really when you're looking at the page, you're sort of scanning and seeing what looks interesting. You're already picking out fragments. You're not necessarily taking in the whole word by word by word. We know this about how people read, because there are certain studies that have been done about if you have the first letter and the last letter of a word, you can still identify, and read, So we're already kind of doing this kind of fragmentation when we're trying to take in information. So I find this really fascinating. And in connection to that, I wanted to ask you a question about, what you know of or have experienced, working in New York, and about the politics, this kind of, because now there's a wave in museums, like kind of decolonizing the collections, returning objects. And I mean, there must be also similar processes going on with archives. And I was just wondering if you had something to add or say about that. Because certainly, as you've already introduced, you mentioned, I mean, you have anybody who's an archivist is already presenting a certain bias, like the bias of the organization, of the intention, and the legacy that you want to leave. But just wondering about that kind of aspect about the decolonization of things, and if you had something to say about that.
Okay. I'll tell you first that fragments are most of my work, meaning I write thousands of poems that are one word or shorter, and up to 9 words long. That's most of my poems are that long. So fragments are powerful for me. As a matter of fact, I once I wrote a book but responding to Sappho's poems as I flew across the country once. I went to an exhibition of object poems in Portland, and on the way back, just to tie everything you said together, and then on the way back, I wrote a poem into the book against what's her name's? I can't even remember. Carson's translations of Sappho. Which is kind of beautiful. And so anytime she mentions herself, it says Geof, but mine don't say what hers do. They say other things. Decolonization is an issue in archives. It's particularly an issue that's focused on in North America. Canadian and American archivists have focused on it a lot. It doesn't come up in my practice because we don't have those kinds of things. It usually comes up if either you have material objects, so that's big in museums, of course, but also if you have other records of indigenous groups. In my work now, all we have are court records. Occasionally, as I noted, there are some indigenous people who show up, but that's about it, unfortunately, especially since mostly I deal with civil records. And the issue is an interesting one because people are still trying to figure out how to do it well, and the processes are not certainly ingrained in stone. And if you look at some practitioners, we did an interview of somebody when we were in Salamanca, a Canadian archivist, about that, and how they have worked with the indigenous communities to come up with solutions. And that's really the major goal of it, to try to bring in the culture whose objects and records you have taken, and make sure that something is done with them that they approve of. There are also processes where you try to make sure that if there are ritual objects, etc., that they can't be used in any way. And there's a lot of what I call depatriation, what I call repatriation. Sorry, depatriation is a different thing that I call repatriation. So giving the cultural, you know, the physical cultural history of groups back to those groups, so they can take care of them as they will. And I think I would say that that's the preferable way to do things. Allow them to take control of their own history, and then manage them how they think is appropriate. They should know better than me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There was one other thing that kind of ties in with that and goes back to the object that you showed us, you know, your visual poem object, thinking about the semiotics of place, you know, because you make that reference about, you know, where you grew up and how the different elements that are included in one place, someone would recognize right away what they were or the shape, or make these kind of recognition, and in other places not. And I just thought maybe if there's something else that you want to talk about that in relation to archives, about this semiotics of place, if there's any comment you had before we finish up.
Just so you know, place to me is normally placelessness, meaning I wrote a huge essay about that once years ago. And so, but place is important, meaning if you stay someplace for a long time, you understand it better, and so you feel it better, and so you have ingested the aura of the place, and the aura is not going to be all good. It's good. Some of it's going to be bad. For goodness sakes, I occasionally go on the subways, not so much these days, and so I think place has a big effect on me because I've lived so many places. My statistic, because I've put everything into databases and I can evaluate it and I can figure it out. Where as a child, I moved on average every 8 months. Most people do not move that frequently.
No.
So that I was always moving from place to place, though I could stay in a place for 18 months. It could happen. And so I don't have what a lot of people do, which is I don't have a place that is the only place for me. I don't have a city I grew up in. I don't have a neighborhood I grew up in. I don't have a house I grew up in. Even if I lived in the city, sometimes I lived in multiple houses on the same street. So, but what I do is I have this concatenation of places, and I think they all affect me. And some I return to all the time. I return to in my head. So it's the meaning of Calacoto, Bolivia is much different than the meaning of Porto, Portugal. They just mean completely different things, and yet they're very integral to who I am. So I was a Portuguese boy. I went to a school where we spoke Portuguese and German. I spoke Portuguese every day. In Bolivia, I spent all my time in the mountains. I feel those mountains in my bones. I know the places of them. I remember when it rained because it almost never rained. And all of these different places give me a different sense. They have a different meaning. They themselves carry meaning, and they carry also the memory of those places, the things that went wrong and the things that went well, and the adventures I took, because I was a boy in the 70s, and parents let you do whatever you wanted to do. So I did all sorts of things. As long as you weren't in the house, you could do whatever you wanted to do. And so I have all these memories which are the meanings of those places to me. But I would say that it's not the meaning that other people have. so that other people will have a different meaning. So if I see a Barbadian, and I said, I will tell them I'm a Bajan boy, because that's how we say. We never say Barbadian. As a matter of fact, it's foreign for me to say it that way. We always say Bajan. It's what are the Bajans like? That's what are we like? Why are we Little Britain? This is it. But other people who live there their whole lives, they're going to feel it in a different way, and yet they're going to overlap, because meaning is determined in the end by individuals making decisions and making interpretations. So that's why.
That's excellent. It was really excellent to hear. I'm glad that I asked you that question.
I think quite a few of us. I think there are quite a few of us. Dee here moved around a ton of times. I lived in 13 different places throughout the United States, not internationally. It gave me a very different perspective from childhood through 18, living in 12, 13 in many different states, right, for different reasons. And so when people say Americans do this, I go, no, I have a different perspective and different history, because they teach different history in the schools in America, depending on what state you're living in. Mm-hmm. And so, no, I don't think of anything as one place as, oh, that's my home, I have to return. But I have good memories of, say, Cincinnati and Minneapolis, and I could say the Bay Area, which is, you meet anybody from the San Francisco Bay Area. And I met someone and she said Bay Area without knowing she'd given me information to her. And I said, oh, she's from the Bay Area. And she thought I'd Googled her and researched. And someone said, no, she's from the Bay Area too. So there are those cute little words from different places, which is interesting. And Dee, who's also here, had moved around a lot as a child and as an adult. So
my dad was in the military and I was in the diplomatic service afterwards. So,
everywhere.
The only point that I returned to regularly was my Italian grandmother's home between Rome and Naples on the sea. And that came to mean a great deal to me, still does. And I'm very close to my cousins. So thank God we had someplace solid.
Yes. And Geof, when you were talking about writing something on a plane, it must have been now 30 years ago. I was on a flight to see Dee in London from LA, and that's a very long 10-hour flight. And somewhere in the middle of the night, I started thinking of just punctuation, which I was dealing with for a while and have done. And all of a sudden it dawned on me, I think it's the lack of oxygen, that we're missing out on that creative aspect of traveling those long hours. And that's where I thought about it and go, what about just the punctuation? And I thought, why not? And then that started that. So
for Dee, my father was a Foreign Service officer, hence my travels. Nobody ever guesses that. They always guess military. I said, military? They don't move as much as we do. Yeah. They stay down for a long time. We left, 18 months was the normal amount of time we stayed, sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes less. Wow. So it's pretty crazy. But my place is actually in the Bay Area. If I had to come to one place, it's 320 Burlingame. It's I was born in the Bay Area. I was born, on the peninsula between the sea and the bay. I have lived on.
And that was one place I lived, Burlingame.
Burlingame, yeah. I'm from Burlingame. I was born in Burlingame. I'm from Hilbert. But so that place, my grandmother's house for 70 years of her life, that's the only place we always went back to. So that's the only thing that sort of feels like a home. But my favorite statistic, I'm going to give it to you, sorry, is I lived on Lake Erie. I lived 3 blocks from the Atlantic. I lived just over the hill from the Pacific. I lived across the street from the Indian Ocean. If it's a large body of water, I have likely lived almost there.
And today.
I suppose this New York Harbor might count.
Yes. Thank you, Geof and Karen and Anne, and if Dee, great to see you.
Kathy, are you
No, I just want to say thanks so much. So interesting. And so of the moment, you know, we have our own little archival problems in Dublin just right this moment. I don't know if you've heard about them at all with the mother and baby homes report.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can
So
hear you.
and it's just interesting, that subtlety between the verbatim recordings being kept or a mediation of those recordings by the commissioners, and that's where the you know, the crux is.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. It was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great stuff.